The ocean was dark that night, the kind of darkness that seemed alive, as if the waves themselves carried whispers from distant shores, and in that endless sea a Viking longship cut through the waters, its wooden hull groaning, its dragon-headed prow shining faintly under the pale moonlight, and the men aboard were silent, not because they were tired, though they were, but because they all felt the weight of something greater than themselves. Something they carried across the ocean that no one dared to name, for these were not ordinary raiders chasing gold, these were chosen men tasked with guarding a mystery as old as the gods, a secret passed from their forefathers, carried across lands and waters, and never to be spoken aloud. And as the waves struck the ship, the leader, Jorund, kept his eyes on the horizon, his mind filled with stories told to him in hushed tones by his grandfather. Stories of objects hidden beneath runestones, of maps carved in wood and bone, of knowledge forbidden yet demanded by kings and feared by priests, for the Vikings were more than mere warriors, they were carriers of memory, of secrets carved in sagas and hidden in the folds of their voyages. And what they carried was not just plunder but something that could shift power, something that could bring kingdoms to ruin or raise them to greatness. And as the night deepened, the stars above glittered, not merely as points of light but as guides in a code, each constellation holding clues, each star linked to directions only those trained in the old ways could decipher. And Jorund knew that tonight's voyage was different, because within the chests at the center of the ship lay more than weapons or silver. There were scrolls written in strange scripts, a fragment of a relic whose origin none could fully understand, and an object wrapped in wolf hide that seemed to hum faintly whenever the moon was high, and though no one spoke of it. The men glanced at it often, their eyes betraying both awe and fear, for they knew the story whispered among their ancestors, that the gods themselves had once walked among men, leaving behind fragments of their power, fragments that should never fall into the wrong hands. And yet here they were, carrying one of those very fragments across the sea, chased by storms, hunted by enemies, and stalked by the weight of their own doubts. And as the longship sliced through the waves, the sea itself seemed restless, as though it knew what it carried. And the men whispered prayers to Odin, to Thor, to Freya, but none dared pray too loudly, for it was said that calling attention to such relics could awaken things better left asleep. And in that eerie silence broken only by the rhythm of the oars, Jorund remembered the last words of the old seeress who had given him the task, her blind eyes fixed on him as she whispered, "The oceans do not hide secrets, they carry them, and what you carry is older than the north, older than Midgard itself. And when the waves rise, you must choose whether to guard it, bury it, or let it consume you." And ever since those words had echoed in his mind, every wave seemed like a test, every storm like a warning, and he wondered whether they were truly sailing towards safety or deeper into the heart of the mystery itself. And behind him the crew murmured of omens, of ravens seen circling above even in the middle of the sea, of sudden chills in the air, of strange lights flickering beneath the waves as if something below was following them. And though Jorund ordered silence, he felt it too, the sense of being watched, as though the ocean itself had eyes. And as dawn approached, the faint outline of land appeared, not the familiar shores of their homelands but a dark, jagged coast shrouded in mist, a place not marked on any map, a place they had not intended to reach, yet the stars had led them there. And Jorund realized with a sinking feeling that perhaps the relic they carried was not only leading them but guiding the ship to where it wanted to go, for the stories had always warned that such objects had a will of their own. And as the longship drew closer, the mist thickened, wrapping them in silence, and the men's hands gripped their axes tighter, though deep down they knew that steel alone would not protect them from what waited on those shores. And so began their landing, their steps sinking into black sand. The relics hummed stronger than ever, the air heavy with the scent of salt and something else, something metallic, almost like blood, and before them rose stones carved with runes none of them recognized, glowing faintly in the dawn, as if welcoming the relic home. And though Jorund's heart pounded, he took the first step forward, knowing that their voyage had only just begun, and that the true secrets the Vikings carried across the oceans were far stranger, darker, and more dangerous than anyone could imagine. For as Jorund stepped onto the black sands of that unmarked coast with his men behind him, he felt as though he were walking not upon ordinary earth but on the edge of some forgotten threshold between worlds, where the breath of the gods still lingered and the shadows remembered names unspoken for centuries. And the stones that rose before them, carved with unfamiliar runes that glowed faintly in the misty dawn, seemed not like mere monuments but like sentinels. Guardians waiting for something to return, and the hum of the relic inside its wolf hide wrappings grew louder with each step, resonating in their bones, a pulse that seemed to match the rhythm of the sea itself. And though the warriors who had braved storms, battles, and the wrath of kings did not fear men, they shifted uneasily now, glancing at one another with questions in their eyes, yet none dared to speak them, for they all knew deep within that they were trespassing on a secret shore where human presence was not meant. And Jorund, who had seen omens before and heard tales of cursed voyages, could not shake the memory of the seeress's words, that the oceans carried secrets, that the relic would demand a choice, and he wondered if this strange land was the place where that choice would be forced upon him. For the stones ahead were not alone. Beyond them loomed shapes, structures half swallowed by the sand and fog, walls that seemed older than any Viking memory, older even than the sagas of the Aesir. And carved upon them were symbols that twisted the eye. One stared too long, not quite runes, not quite pictures, but something in between, as though language itself was struggling to take form in stone. And as the warriors advanced, torches flickering in the heavy mist, they felt the ground beneath them change, the sand giving way to stone slabs carefully laid, forming a pathway that led deeper into the strange coastline. And here the air thickened, heavy with the smell of salt, blood, and something ancient, like wet iron or burned offerings. And as they walked, the relic and its wrappings seemed to grow warmer, as though it recognized the path. And Jorund thought of the stories his grandfather had whispered by the fire, of the time when gods and giants warred, when fragments of power fell into the mortal world, shards of the divine scattered like embers, and men who found them were cursed to guard them, to carry them across lands and seas so that no one realm would ever hold too much. And perhaps this object was one of those shards. Perhaps it was the very thing that gave rise to tales of Odin's missing eye, of Mimir's well, of treasures buried beneath the roots of Yggdrasil. But as he thought this, the wind shifted, and a low sound filled the air, not the crash of waves or the cry of gulls, but something deeper, a resonance that vibrated through the stones themselves, and the men froze, hands gripping their axes, for it was not a sound of this world. More like the echo of voices speaking beneath the earth, and the runes on the stones seemed to flicker, glowing brighter as if stirred awake, and suddenly one of the warriors, a young man named Eirik, cried out as though struck, falling to his knees and clutching his head, his voice strained with terror as he screamed that he could see images, great ships of fire sailing across skies, men bowing before figures of immense height, rivers of blood flowing into the sea, and a great serpent coiled around the world tightening its grip. And then he fell silent, eyes wide open but unseeing, and the others stepped back in horror, crossing themselves with the signs of Thor's hammer, muttering prayers, while Jorund knelt beside him, shaking him. But Eirik's lips only moved in whispers no one understood, as though another tongue was speaking through him. And the relic inside the wolf hide throbbed once, a pulse so strong that every man felt it in his chest, and for a heartbeat the mist cleared, revealing in the distance a great stone doorway carved into a cliff, its arch towering above them, its surface etched with spirals and symbols so intricate they seemed alive. And though the vision lasted only a moment, all saw it, and all knew this was where the relic was leading them. And Jorund, though his heart was heavy, understood that turning back was no longer possible, for the sea itself had carried them here, and whatever awaited within that doorway was bound to their fate. And so he rose, his voice steady though his hands trembled, commanding the men to carry Eirik, to bring the chests, to light more torches, for their path lay forward, into the stones, into the unknown, into the secret heart of the world. And as they advanced toward the place where the mist had revealed the doorway, the earth seemed to grow quieter, the sound of the sea fading until only the beat of their own hearts could be heard. And they reached the cliffside where the doorway stood, not hidden, not ruined, but waiting, its arch unmarred by time, its carvings sharp as though cut yesterday. And above it a single rune burned faintly, a rune none of them had ever seen before, though Jorund thought it resembled a serpent swallowing its own tail. And when he touched it with his hand, the stone felt warm, alive almost, and at once the door groaned, the slabs of rock shifting, opening inward with a sound like 1,000 bones grinding, and the men stepped back in awe and fear, gripping their weapons tighter. But Jorund motioned them forward, for he knew that whatever secrets the Vikings carried across the oceans, they were bound to be revealed inside this place. and as they crossed the threshold, the air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of old earth, oil, and something sweet like decay, and torches flickered against walls lined with carvings depicting not only gods and giants but men walking beside them, men holding objects that glowed, men sailing across seas under strange stars, and in some carvings, men falling as serpents rose from beneath the waves, and as they advanced deeper into the passage, they came upon a chamber vast and echoing, with a floor of polished stone and a ceiling lost in darkness, and at its center stood a pedestal, carved from a single block of obsidian, upon which rested a hollow depression shaped exactly to fit the relic they carried, and the hum from the wolf-hide bundle was now so strong it shook their bones, pulling them toward the pedestal as if demanding to be placed. And the warriors looked at Jorund with fear, for they knew that whatever happened here could not be undone, but Jorund's mind burned with the seeress's warning, that the relic would demand a choice, to guard, to bury, or to be consumed, and though part of him longed to turn and flee, he knew the sea would not let them, for the sea had brought them here with purpose, and so with a deep breath he stepped forward, laying the bundle upon the stone, unwrapping the wolf hide, revealing at last the relic they had carried across the oceans, and when the cloth fell away, the chamber filled with light, blinding, searing, a light that was not fire, not moon, not sun, but something deeper, older, the kind of light that seemed to remember the dawn of the world, and in its glow they saw not just the chamber but visions, men of old burying the relic beneath mountains, priests chanting in tongues long dead, kings kneeling and swearing oaths to shadows, and ships like theirs sailing across endless seas to hide fragments of this same power in distant lands, in caves, in mountains, in deserts, so that never again would one people hold it all. And Jorund staggered, his heart pounding, his mind filled with questions, but the relic pulsed again, and the chamber shook, dust falling from the unseen ceiling, and in the echoes of that quake came a voice, deep and resonant, not from any man, not from any throat, but from the stones themselves, a voice that spoke in no tongue yet was understood by all, saying, "Carriers of memory, you have crossed the sea as did those before you, and you stand now at the gate of remembrance, but know this, what you carry cannot be owned, it can only be borne, and those who would keep it invite ruin, those who would bury it invite silence, and those who would awaken it invite the end of all ages." And then the vision shattered, the light dimming, the chamber settling, the relic now quiet upon the pedestal as though it had never moved, and the men gasped, some falling to their knees, others crossing themselves, and Jorund stood trembling, for he realized that the relic was not only a fragment of power but a burden passed from one people to another, a secret so great that the world itself seemed bent on scattering it across the oceans, and he wondered if their voyage had been one of choice at all, or if they had merely been chosen, drawn into a web of fate spun long before their births. And as he gazed upon the relic, silent now but heavy with promise, he knew that their journey was far from over, that what they carried across the sea was not merely for themselves, but for all who would come after, for kingdoms yet unborn, for generations who would forget their names but live beneath the shadow of their choices. And as he turned to his men, he saw in their faces both terror and awe, the knowledge that they were bound now to this mystery, and that whatever lay ahead in this hidden place, it was only the beginning of a saga whose end none could yet see, for as the echoes of the chamber's voice faded into the silence of stone and shadow, Jorund felt the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes pressing upon him, as though every ancestor, every god, every forgotten spirit of sea and land were watching to see what choice he would make. And in that suffocating quiet the relic lay upon its pedestal, no longer glowing, no longer pulsing, but its stillness was not the stillness of death but of a beast waiting, breathing shallow, coiled and patient, and the men shifted uneasily around him, the strongest of them trembling. For though they had crossed oceans and faced kings, what they stood before now was not flesh and blood but something beyond the grasp of axe and shield. And Jorund raised his torch higher, its light barely biting into the vastness of the chamber, revealing carvings that seemed to writhe in the flickering glow, scenes of men bearing relics across oceans just as they had, scenes of ships lost to storms not of nature but of will, scenes of warriors kneeling before shadowy figures who towered over them with eyes like burning suns. And Jorund realized with a chill that this place was no tomb, no temple, but a memory-given form, a vault where history itself had been carved in stone so that those who came after would remember, or perhaps so they would be warned. And he thought of the seeress again, her blind eyes staring through him as she whispered of oceans carrying secrets. And he wondered if she had seen this place in her visions, if she had known he would stand here, torch in hand, with the relic resting where it seemed to belong. And as these thoughts tangled in his mind, a low groan rolled through the chamber, deep and slow like the earth itself shifting, and dust rained from the unseen heights above, and the men raised their shields instinctively though no blade was coming, and from the far wall of the chamber came a change, the carvings themselves beginning to move, their etched figures stepping forth as if the stone were water. Shadows peeling from rock to take shape, not fully alive yet not mere illusion, forms that towered, cloaked in darkness, eyes glimmering faintly with the light of ages. And the men fell back, axes raised, but Joran stood rooted, his breath caught in his throat, for he understood that these were no enemies of flesh but echoes, guardians not of the relic itself but of the memory it carried, and the shapes spoke without mouths. Their voices like the grinding of glaciers, slow and terrible, saying that every bearer of the relic was bound not only to carry its weight but to add to its story, to weave their own blood and choices into the fabric of the saga, for the relic was not a treasure, not a weapon, not even a curse, but a vessel of memory, a shard of the world's first dawn when gods and giants fought and creation itself trembled, and it remembered everything, all who had touched it, all who had bled for it, all who had tried to claim it, and now it would remember them, the sons of the North, who had dared to cross the ocean and step into this hidden place. And as the words sank into their bones, Joran felt the relic stir once more, a faint hum like a heartbeat that was not his own, and he knew that to leave it here upon the pedestal was not the end, for already he felt its threads binding him, tying him to those who had come before, and those who would come after, and he saw in his mind flashes of far-off lands, deserts where other shards lay buried beneath sand, jungles where stones swallowed by roots glimmered faintly, mountains where fires guarded secrets too terrible to name, and oceans, always oceans, carrying ships like theirs across the world, each bearing fragments of the same mystery. And he understood that the Vikings were not the first and would not be the last, but they had been chosen as others had been chosen. Not for their strength of arms but for their willingness to sail where no map could guide them, to trust the stars and the pull of fate. And with that realization came dread, for he knew this was not a burden he could cast aside, nor one his men could bear without breaking, and already he saw the toll in their faces, pale and drawn, eyes wide as though they had glimpsed something they could never unsee, and some muttered prayers to Odin, others to Christ, but all were unanswered, for here in this place older than gods, older than faith, there was only the hum of memory, the whisper of stone, and the slow, patient weight of eternity pressing down, and then the shadows receded, slipping back into the carvings, leaving the chamber once more in silence, the only sound their ragged breaths and the faint crackle of torches. And the world itself had remembered what it had long tried to forget, for as Joran and his weary men stepped once more into the biting dawn, the stone chamber behind them echoing with silence too heavy to belong to an empty hall, the relic seemed to thrum faintly in the marrow of their bones though they had left it on the pedestal, as if it had chosen to stretch its memory into them, binding them not through touch but through presence. And every footstep they took upon the black sand outside carried with it the sense of being watched not only by unseen eyes in the mist but by the weight of centuries pressing down, reminding them that the saga they carried was no longer their own but part of something larger. And the men whispered in low tones about what they had seen, the moving carvings, the shadows that spoke, the way young Eirik's eyes had glowed with a light not his own, and though their voices trembled they dared not speak too loud, for even the cry of a gull seemed out of place in that haunted coast, and Joran, standing tall though exhaustion weighed on his shoulders, felt the pull of duty gnaw at him, knowing that the choice he had avoided in the chamber would not vanish simply because he had turned his back. And as he gazed at the endless horizon where the gray sea met the pale light, he wondered if the ocean itself was now guiding them, if the stars would no longer obey his reading but bend toward a fate already written. And so he ordered the longship readied, the dragon prow facing once more the restless waters, and though his men hesitated, glancing back at the mist-draped ruins that seemed to breathe with unseen life, they obeyed, for to remain was worse than to sail, and soon the ship was afloat, oars biting the tide, sails straining under the cold wind, and the coastline faded into the shroud of fog until it was swallowed whole, leaving only memory, yet memory was now heavier than any cargo. for the relic's echo followed them, and each man carried it differently. Some muttered prayers to gods old and new, others sharpened axes needlessly, their hands trembling, and Eirik lay silent, his chest rising shallowly, his face pale yet touched by that strange afterglow that made the others avoid his gaze, for though he breathed he seemed half gone, half bound to something beyond, and Joran sat at the stern, hand on the tiller, his eyes never leaving the horizon. Though in his mind he saw flashes that were not his own, vast deserts where storms buried ruins older than kings, forests so deep the sun never pierced, islands of fire where molten rivers glowed under stars, and each vision carried with it a sense of fragments, shards of memory scattered across the world, all calling to each other, all humming the same silent song that the relic in the chamber had breathed into his bones, and he realized with dread that their burden was not only to guard but to choose, to carry forward or to bury forever, and the choice would not be given lightly, for already the sea itself rose in defiance, waves higher, foam lashing, as though Poseidon, if such a god were real, rose to test them, though the Northmen named it Aegir, the lord of waves, and they shouted into the wind, their beards whipping in salt spray, voices defiant yet tinged with fear, for they knew the sea had always been both pathway and grave, and now it seemed more grave than path, and Joran ordered them steady, reminding them that they had crossed worse, though his own heart whispered otherwise, for the storm carried not only wind but whispers, voices curling in the gusts, calling his name in tongues he should not have known, voices that spoke of kingdoms fallen, of blood spilled on altars, of secrets buried so deep they should never have been unearthed, and he clenched his jaw, steering through it, refusing to yield, until at last the storm broke, sudden as it had come, leaving the sea unnaturally calm. The sky cleared of cloud, the stars blazing brighter than ever as though newly lit, and the men breathed relief, though it was hollow, for calm seas in such times were more fearful than raging ones, and then came the omen that silenced even the bravest, a raven circling high above, black wings against the silver moon, though they were far from land, and it croaked once, twice, thrice, before diving low, its eyes glinting unnaturally, and Joran felt his blood chill. For in the sagas a raven meant Odin's watch, yet this bird carried not the wisdom of Hugin and Munin but the weight of judgment, and when it vanished into the night they all sat in silence, gripping their oars tighter, unwilling to speak what they all feared, that the gods themselves had turned their gaze upon them, not in blessing but in trial, and as days passed, their provisions dwindled faster than they should have, barrels of water soured though sealed, fish slipped nets though plentiful, and men grew gaunt, their eyes haunted, as if the relic's unseen touch starved them from within. And yet they pressed on, for to turn back was to face shame and curse alike, and Joran's dreams grew darker each night, visions of halls of gold crumbling to dust, of runestones bleeding, of the world tree itself shuddering as wolves tore at its roots, and always he heard the same whisper, "Guard, bury, awaken, guard, bury, awaken," until he woke drenched in sweat, hand on his sword, though no enemy was near. And one night, as stars blazed like fire above, Eirik stirred again, his voice weak yet carrying an echo not his own, saying, "The seas carry us not where we wish, but where it remembers." And then his eyes closed once more, and the men crossed themselves or touched amulets, for none could mistake the meaning, that the relic was guiding them, not chance, not Jorand, not even the stars. And so when on the seventh dawn land rose again from the horizon, a jagged coast unfamiliar to any map they knew, a land of cliffs and forests, and strange stone shapes upon the shore, Joran felt the weight of fate settle upon his shoulders once more, for he knew the relic was pulling them where it willed, to places forgotten, to secrets older than gods, and though he longed to sail past, to find home, he felt the ship turn almost of its own accord, sails filling with unnatural wind, prow aimed toward destiny, and he whispered under his breath a prayer not to Odin, nor Thor, nor Christ, but to whatever ancient force now bound them, to spare his men if not himself, and the others saw his lips move though they did not hear the words, and silence fell heavy as the longship cut toward the unknown shore, every man knowing though none spoke it aloud, that their saga was only deepening, and the secrets they carried across the oceans would demand from them a price greater than any gold, greater than any blood already spilled, a price that would be paid not once but again and again, until the very world remembered all it had sought to forget. And so it was that the weight of memory pressed upon Jorund and his weary crew as the dragon-prowed longship glided toward the unknown shore, the silence of men and sea broken only by the creak of oars and the whisper of sails. And though their eyes fixed upon the jagged cliffs that loomed higher with every passing moment, each heart beat with dread, for they felt not as voyagers approaching land but as trespassers drawn into a realm where no mortal feet should tread. And the raven's cry still echoed in their bones, reminding them that gods or something older still marked their passage, and Jorund, though he held himself tall at the stern, felt the tightening of fate's net about him, the relics unseen pull more commanding than wind or wave, and when the prow scraped against the black-rocked shore slick with foam, the men leapt not with cheer of landfall but with grim resolve, axes in hand though no foe awaited, for the enemy was unseen, woven into the air itself, and as their boots pressed into the alien soil they saw shapes rising from the mist, stone monoliths carved with lines unlike any rune they knew, spirals and eyes and beasts with too many limbs, and the marks seemed to twist when looked upon, as though alive, as though the stones themselves recalled a language that predated gods. And one of the younger men, Halfdan, whispered of Jotun trickery, but Jorund hushed him, for he knew instinctively that these carvings were not tricks but records, fragments of some memory older than the 9 worlds. And as they pressed further into the forests beyond, trees loomed vast and knotted, their roots crawling like serpents over the soil, their trunks marked with scars as if cut by hands of giants long before mankind. And the deeper they walked, the heavier the air became, thick with damp and silence, broken only by the labored breaths of men who felt watched. And soon they came upon a clearing where the earth fell away into a great hollow, a vast pit rimmed with stone, and within its depths water gleamed black as obsidian, still as glass, reflecting not the sky but strange patterns of light that seemed to pulse from beneath. And the men muttered of sorcery, yet Jorund, compelled by something within, stepped closer, and as he peered down he saw images ripple across the surface, fleeting glimpses of longships burning, of towers crumbling, of warriors in helms unlike theirs raising swords of bronze. And deeper still he saw deserts beneath stars unknown, and pyramids casting shadows longer than mountains, and he staggered back, heart racing, for the vision was no trick of weariness but a memory awakened, and the relic's echo in his marrow answered the water's call, binding image to image, history to history. Until he realized with dread that these were not merely pictures but truths preserved, fragments of what the world itself remembered, hidden deep in stone and water, and the pit was a vessel of that memory, a mirror of ages past. And when he turned his gaze upon his men he saw in their eyes that some too had glimpsed the visions, though they paled and shook their heads as if to deny them. For to acknowledge such things was to accept that their saga was but a thread in a tapestry vast beyond comprehension. And before Jorund could speak, Eirik stirred once more, his voice faint yet ringing with the weight of something not his own, saying, "It remembers because it must, and it shows because we are chosen to bear it." And then his frail body fell again into silence, leaving the men staring at him with fear and awe, unwilling to approach yet unable to turn away. And Jorund clenched his fists, torn between the urge to protect his men from the burden and the duty to face what destiny had laid before them. And even as he wrestled within, the still waters of the pit began to ripple without wind, circles spreading wider, and then from the center rose a column of light pale and cold, reaching skyward like a spear of memory itself. And within the light shadows danced, shadows of kings crowned in gold, of queens draped in veils of silver, of warriors and priests, and nameless figures all fading in and out, their mouths moving in silence, their eyes fixed upon the intruders. And the men fell to their knees, some crying out prayers, others clutching weapons uselessly, for what blade could cut shadow, what shield guard against memory? And Jorund alone stood, his heart pounding like war drums, his breath ragged, yet his feet moved of their own accord toward the light, for within it he saw not strangers but echoes of himself, reflections of lives lived long ago yet bound to his own. And when he reached the edge he felt the relic's hum rise in his bones until it was nearly unbearable, and the whisper returned, no longer faint but clear, thundering in his skull, "Guard Barry, awaken! Guard Barry, awaken!" And he realized at last that these were not commands to him alone but choices made across ages by those before, each guardian choosing whether to protect, to hide, or to unleash, and the relic had bound him to this chain of choices. And now the burden was his, yet before he could act, the light trembled, flared, and from its depths rose a figure cloaked in shadows. Tall and crowned with a helm of horns, its form neither wholly man nor wholly beast, and though it spoke no words aloud, its presence pressed into every mind, and each man felt what Jorund felt, that this was no god of Asgard nor Christ's angel, but something older, something that had watched men crawl from caves and build kingdoms only to watch them fall, something that remembered because the world itself could not bear to forget. And it stretched a hand toward Jorund, long fingers ending in claws of shadow, and in that gesture he felt both promise and threat, both gift and curse, and his knees trembled, for he knew if he took it, his fate would be sealed forever, his soul bound to memory unending, but if he refused, perhaps the burden would fall heavier on his men, on the world, and so he stood at the edge of the pit, torn between choices that were no choices at all. While the forest grew silent, the men held their breath. And the world seemed to lean closer, waiting. And in that silence where even the forest seemed to have stilled its breath, where the mist hung heavy like the veil between the living and the remembered, Jorund felt the weight of ages pressing upon his shoulders, for as the figure of shadow stretched its hand toward him, crowned in horns that seemed to twist like branches of a tree older than Yggdrasil itself, he realized that this was no mere vision conjured by water and light, but a presence that had endured since before sagas were sung, before runes were carved, before even the gods themselves had claimed dominion over the 9 worlds. And though his men crouched behind him, trembling, clutching amulets of Thor's hammer or crossing themselves in fear, their voices swallowed by dread, Jorund alone stood facing that ancient being, his breath ragged, his heart beating like the great war drums of distant tribes. And as he stared into its hollow eyes, he felt the relics hum and his bones rise until it drowned even his thoughts. Merging with the whisper that had haunted his dreams, "Guard, Barry, awaken! Guard, Barry, awaken!" As though the choice was carved into the marrow of existence itself, repeated across ages by those who had come before, guardians who had stood where he stood, staring into the abyss of memory, forced to decide not for themselves alone but for all who would follow. And in that moment Jorund's mind was filled with visions. Not fleeting glimpses this time, but torrents of memory too vast to belong to one man. He saw ships not of oak and iron but of reed and gold cutting across seas beneath strange constellations, saw ziggurats rise from desert sands only to be swallowed again by time, saw men in bronze helms carrying idols of lions and bulls across mountains, saw rivers carved by human hands to mimic the stars above, and deeper still he saw wars not sung of, battles forgotten, where kings spilled oceans of blood not for land or gold but to bury something, to seal something, to keep hidden. The relics of memory itself, and through it all the same rhythm pulsed. Guard, Barry, awaken. And Jorund realized with horror that he was not the first, nor the last, but only one in a line stretching back to the dawn of mankind, each chosen, each burdened, each tested, and his knees weakened beneath the weight of such knowledge, for how could one man, one ship of weary souls, bear what civilizations had died to conceal? And yet the shadow waited, hand extended, the forest leaning closer as though the trees themselves longed to hear his answer, and the waters of the pit rippled though no wind stirred, casting reflections of warriors in armor he did not know, their faces painted with ash, their eyes hollow like his own, and he understood then that to take the hand was to bind himself to memory eternal, to awaken what others had chosen to bury, but to refuse was not release, it was to let the burden fall elsewhere, heavier, darker, for memory would not vanish, it would only shift, waiting for another soul to carry it, and he clenched his fists, torn between a duty he had not sought and a fate he could not escape, while behind him his men muttered prayers, their voices trembling, some whispering to Odin, others to Christ, others only to the nameless sea. And Eirik stirred again, his frail body shuddering, his lips moving with words that were not wholly his own. "It will not wait forever, Jorund, it never waits forever." And his voice broke like wind through a hollow bone, sending a shiver through every spine, and the figure of shadow inclined its head, as if acknowledging the truth spoken, its clawed hand unmoving, its presence unbearable yet patient, and Jorund's mind spun with memories not his own, with sagas unwritten, with the cries of men long dead, and he thought of his father, who had told him once that a man is measured not by the wars he wins but by the burdens he carries. And he thought of his son unborn, who might live or perish depending on the choice made here, and he thought of the sea itself, vast and endless, yet always remembering, for every wave that crashed upon the shore carried echoes of storms past, and at last he raised his hand, trembling yet steady, and for a breath the world itself seemed to halt, the forest leaning in, the pit glowing brighter, his men gasping, and when his hand touched the shadows, the cold of it pierced him deeper than steel, deeper than ice, burrowing into his veins, freezing his marrow, yet at the same time filling him with a fire that was not heat but memory itself, and the world exploded into visions so vast he thought his skull would crack, his eyes burn away, his soul shatter into 1,000 shards, for he saw the ages as they had been and as they might be, the rise of empires beneath blazing suns, the fall of kingdoms into ash, the birth of gods from the prayers of men, the death of gods when those prayers ceased. And woven through it all the relics, not one but many, scattered across the world, each a vessel of memory, each a fragment of some truth too immense to be borne whole. And he saw pyramids not only in Egypt but in lands across oceans, he saw stones raised in circles upon moors, he saw carvings etched into cliffs by hands unknown, and he realized with horror and awe that all these were not monuments of pride but anchors of memory, prisons and keys alike, each built to guard, to bury, or to awaken. And now he was part of that chain, his fate sealed as surely as any rune, carved in stone, and when at last the visions faded he found himself kneeling at the edge of the pit, sweat pouring down his face, his chest heaving, his hands still clasped by the shadow, though its form was dissolving, unraveling into mist that flowed back into the column of light, leaving only its voice in his mind. "You have taken, you have bound, you will carry." And with that the light collapsed, plunging the clearing into darkness save for the pale gleam of the pit. And silence returned, heavy and absolute, until at last one of the men, Halfdan, dared to speak, his voice breaking. "What have you done, Jorund?" And though Jorund longed to answer, to ease their fear, he found no words, for his tongue felt heavy, his throat dry, and only Eirik, pale and trembling, whispered the truth none wished to hear. "He has awakened what should not wake, and now it will follow wherever he sails." And the men groaned, some cursing, some weeping, some gripping their axes as though steel could cut fate itself. But Jorund rose, his body shaking yet his eyes alight with something fierce, something burdened, and he said, at last, "We cannot bury what we do not understand, nor guard what we do not know, but we will carry it, for if not us, then who?" And though his men did not answer, though their eyes were filled with dread, they followed when he turned away from the pit, for the bond of oath and ship was stronger than fear, and together they made their way back through the ancient forest, though every tree seemed to watch them now, every shadow seemed to whisper, until at last they reached the shore where the longship waited, rocking gently on the tide, and as they pushed it into the surf and leapt aboard, Jorund at the tiller once more. The sea opened before them not as path but as trial, and the horizon burned with the promise of storms yet to come, for the burden they carried was no longer unseen, no longer silent, but alive within them, waiting for the day it would demand its due, and the world, though vast, felt suddenly smaller, as if every wave, every star, every wind was drawing them inexorably toward a fate already written in the memory of the earth itself. And though the sea stretched vast and endless before them, though the horizon lay distant like a promise that could never be reached, Jorund and his weary crew felt the invisible weight pressing upon them heavier than the carved prow of their dragon ship, for the burden they carried was no longer only the relic in Jorund's hand nor the visions that haunted their dreams, but something greater, something that lived in the marrow of their bones, something ancient that had chosen them. And as the oars struck the waters in rhythm, as the sail caught the wind and pulled them further from the black-rocked shore and its mist-shrouded forest, each man glanced not outward toward the sea but inward, for in the silence of their hearts they felt the pull of memory itself, voices whispering of wars long past, of monuments raised and toppled, of kings whose names were dust yet whose deeds lingered like echoes, and though they said nothing aloud, their eyes betrayed the terror of men who knew they were no longer free voyagers but unwilling guardians chained to a saga older than their gods, and Jorund, standing tall though his shoulders bent with unseen weight, felt the tiller quiver in his grip as though the very sea resisted him, and he thought of the words spoken by the shadow, words that burned into his mind like runes carved with fire. "You have taken, you have bound, you will carry," and he wondered not whether he could endure but whether he should. For in the visions he had seen pyramids beneath strange stars, temples rising from jungles, stones etched with spirals no man could read, and each place bore the same burden. Each civilization had touched what he now carried, and each had fallen, their glories buried beneath sand and sea, their stories broken, their names forgotten. And if such mighty peoples could not withstand the weight, how could a single longship of weary Northmen hope to do so? Yet he could not cast it aside, could not return it. For once bound, the relic was not stone or metal but memory itself, lodged within him like a second soul, whispering in rhythms of guard, bury, awaken. And as night fell and the stars came alive above the endless sea, Joran lifted his gaze to them, tracing constellations that his forefathers had followed, the bear, the serpent, the plough. Yet now among them he saw others, faint shapes he had never noticed, patterns foreign to his tongue yet familiar to his new burdened heart. And he realized with a shiver that these too were part of the memory. Maps not of land alone but of destiny, of places where other relics might sleep, waiting for those who dared or were cursed to awaken them. And when the wind howled and the sea swelled, his men prayed to Thor for safe passage, to Odin for wisdom, to Christ for mercy. But Joran prayed to none, for he felt in his bones that gods themselves were but fragments of the same memory, born of men's fears, sustained by men's words, and perhaps destined to vanish when men ceased to speak them. And he wondered then if the burden he carried was not older even than the gods, a truth that gave rise to them all, a memory so vast that no single faith could hold it, no single people could guard it. And as these thoughts tormented him, he heard Eirik stir again, the old man pale as the moonlight, his breath ragged, his eyes sunken yet alight with the glow of someone who saw more than the living, and he whispered, "The sea remembers too, Jorund. Every tide, every storm, every drowned soul is written upon its skin, and it does not forgive." And then he slumped again into silence, leaving the men staring with unease, for they too had begun to hear things in the waves. Low murmurs like voices beneath the foam, whispers rising when the wind stilled, as though the sea itself sought to speak, and though they tried to dismiss it as weariness, as madness from hunger or fear, the truth gnawed at them, that they were not alone upon these waters, for the sea had eyes, the sea had memory, and the sea did not forget. And soon storms rose, not sudden as tempests often are but slow, deliberate, as though summoned by something unseen, clouds gathering like black mountains, thunder rumbling deep and distant, lightning flickering upon the horizon in shapes that looked not like bolts but like runes, jagged symbols across the sky. And the men cowered, some crossing themselves, others gripping charms of Thor. For though they were warriors they knew no axe nor shield could ward against a storm carved by fate. And Jorund, gripping the tiller until his knuckles whitened, felt again the relic hum within him, answering the storm, pulsing in rhythm with the thunder. And in a moment of clarity he realized that the storm was not against them but calling to them, guiding them, as though the sea itself sought to test whether they would endure, whether they were worthy to carry what they bore. And through rain and crashing waves they sailed, their ship tossed like driftwood, their beards whipped by salt, their bodies bruised by the fury of waters. Yet they did not founder, for each time the mast cracked it held, each time the waves threatened to engulf them the ship rose again. And when dawn came at last, red and raw upon the horizon, the storm faded as though it had never been, leaving the sea calm, the sky clear, and the men broken yet alive, staring at their captain with awe and dread, whispering that perhaps Odin had steered them, or Christ, or some darker power. But Jorund said nothing, for he knew the truth, that it was not God nor chance but memory itself, testing, watching, binding. And when he raised his eyes he saw far in the distance a shape upon the waters, not an island, not a ship, but something vast and ancient, rising from the sea like a mountain, its sides etched with lines that gleamed in the morning sun. And as they drew closer the men gasped. For it was no mountain of stone but a structure carved by hands, tier upon tier rising from the waves, a pyramid, greater than any they had seen or imagined, its summit lost in clouds, its surface covered in carvings of beasts and stars and eyes that seemed to follow them as they approached. And Jorun's heart pounded, for he had seen it before, in the visions of the pit, beneath stars not of their sky, and yet here it stood, impossibly, upon the endless ocean, waiting, remembering, guarding. And his men fell silent. For what words could be spoken when faced with such a sight, a monument of forgotten ages? Proof that the world was older, stranger, vaster than their sagas had ever dared tell. And as the ship drew nearer, the waters grew still, no wave breaking, no wind stirring, as though the sea itself bowed to this monument, and in that stillness Joran felt the relic within him burn hotter, its hum turning to a roar in his skull, and he knew with certainty that their voyage was not chance, not folly, but fate, that they had been drawn here as countless others before them, to a place where memories slept beneath the sea, guarded, buried, waiting to be awakened, and when their keels scraped against stone steps descending into the water, the men froze, unwilling to move, but Joran rose, his hand upon the relic bound to his flesh, and he said, his voice steady though his heart trembled, "We did not choose this path, but it has chosen us, and to turn away is no longer ours to command. We climb, we learn, we carry." And though his men shook their heads, though fear burned in their eyes, they followed, for their oaths bound them, and their fates were woven into his, and together they stepped from the longship onto the drowned pyramid, where each stone thrummed with ancient power, where each carving seemed to shift when gazed upon, and the air was thick not with salt or mist but with memory itself, pressing into their lungs, filling their bones, and as they began to climb higher and higher, the world around them faded, the sea, the sky, the horizon, all dissolving into a vast whiteness where only the pyramid remained, and Joran knew then that they had crossed the threshold, that they were no longer in the world of men but in the realm of memory itself, and every step they took was a step into the past, into the truth, into the secret carried across oceans not by Vikings alone but by every people who had lived and died, for the burden they bore was not theirs alone but the earth's, the seas, the stars, and now it waited to be told, to be remembered, to be carried. And as they climbed, higher and higher upon that impossible pyramid rising from the endless sea, their breath ragged, their limbs heavy as though every stone demanded a toll in blood and spirit, Joran felt the world itself unraveling around them, the horizon dissolving, the sea vanishing, the sky thinning until only the stairway remained, spiraling upward into a vast whiteness that pulsed not with light but with memory itself, and though his men faltered, some muttering that they were walking not upon stone but upon the bones of giants, others whispering that the steps stretched further than Midgard itself, none dared turn back, for the relic's hum bound them, thrumming through their hearts in rhythm with the echoes beneath their feet, and Joran, though he bore the greatest weight, pressed onward, his mind filled with visions that flickered like lightning at the edge of thought. Cities swallowed by desert yet still alive in the silence beneath the sands, mountains carved into faces whose eyes bled with rain, rivers red as though remembering battles drowned in their depths, and at each step he understood with a clarity that chilled him, that this place was no temple of worship, no monument of pride, but a vault, a vessel, a repository where the memory of all that had been buried was stored, guarded not by walls but by the very fabric of existence. And as they ascended, the carvings upon the steps shifted, their lines twisting until they became stories, not written in runes nor in letters but in visions forced into the mind, so that when one man touched a glyph of a lion carved into the stone, he cried out, falling to his knees, his eyes rolling as he beheld a battle long past in which men clothed in bronze and gold clashed beneath a desert sun, and when another brushed his hand against a spiral, he screamed as rivers of fire poured through his thoughts, showing him a city that had burned before men even knew iron, and so it was with every symbol, each a doorway, each a shard of memory too vast to belong to the living, and though Joran bade his men look away, keep climbing, the vision seeped into them all, filling their minds with knowledge they could neither carry nor discard, for memory, once seen, could not be unremembered, and still they climbed, until their breaths were little more than gasps, until their hearts thundered like drums of war, until at last they reached a plateau where the steps widened into a vast terrace, a platform ringed with colossal statues whose forms shifted when gazed upon. Sometimes they appeared as men, tall and robed, bearing staffs of light, sometimes as beasts with wings of stone and eyes of flame, sometimes as shadows crowned with horns that twisted like the branches of Yggdrasil, and Joran realized with horror that these were not statues at all but guardians, echoes of those who had carried the burden before him, each bound eternally to this place, either alive nor dead, watching with eyes that burned not with hatred but with the cold weight of remembrance, and in their silence the men quailed, clutching their weapons though they knew iron could not bite stone nor shadow, and one, Halfdan, spat upon the ground, crying out that they were cursed, that this was no place for mortals, that they should turn back before the sea swallowed them, but before his words could fade, The air itself trembled. A soundless pressure pressing against their skulls until blood ran from their ears, and the guardians shifted, their mouths opening not with breath but with the voices of ages, a chorus that rang within the marrow of every bone. Guard, bury, awaken, and the men fell to their knees, trembling. But Jorund alone stood, his hand clutching the relic that burned now like fire against his flesh, and he raised his voice though it cracked beneath the weight of memory. We did not seek this, yet it has found us, and if we must carry it, then tell us why, tell us what. It is that every people before us has guarded, has buried, has feared to awaken. And at his words the air stilled, the guardians froze, and the whiteness around them rippled as though it were water disturbed by a stone, and then it parted, unveiling not sky nor sea but a vast chamber carved within the pyramid itself, its walls lined with tablets of stone, of clay, of crystal, of materials unknown, each inscribed with markings that writhed when looked upon, shifting between runes and hieroglyphs and scripts no man had ever seen. And in the center of the chamber stood a pedestal upon which lay a sphere, dark as night yet glimmering with veins of light that pulsed like a beating heart. And Jorund knew at once, without words, without thought, that this was the core, the heart of memory itself, the vessel into which all fragments converged. And as he stepped forward his men cried out, begging him to stop, to turn away. For the whispers in their minds had grown louder, the voices of forgotten kings and fallen warriors, of drowned sailors and slain priests, all pleading, all warning, all screaming that to touch the heart was to awaken not knowledge but doom. Yet Jorund's feet moved as if pulled, his hand trembling as the relic within him surged, calling to the sphere like iron to magnet, and when he drew near the pedestal the guardians stirred, their eyes flaring, their voices rising in a single, thunderous command. Guard, bury, awaken, and the very ground shook as though the pyramid itself lived, and the whiteness beyond the chamber shattered into glimpses of the world, oceans boiling, mountains cracking, stars falling like sparks into darkness. And still Jorund reached, not because he willed it but because memory itself demanded it, and in that moment he understood the terrible truth, that the relic he bore was not a burden placed upon him but a key, and that his coming here had never been chance but design, for the sea, the storm, the visions, all had been guiding him to this place, to this choice. And when his hand touched the sphere the world collapsed into silence, absolute, unbroken, as if even time itself had paused to watch, and then came the flood, not of water but of memory, pouring into him, drowning him, suffocating him in visions of ages before man had words, before gods had names, before the earth itself had cooled, when shadows of thought had walked the void, when beings vast and formless had woven existence from light and dark. And he saw how they had carved memory into stone and flesh, how they had bound fragments of themselves into relics scattered across worlds so that nothing would be forgotten, not even the first breath of creation. And he saw too why every people had built pyramids, why every civilization had raised monuments. For each had found fragments of that memory, each had tried to guard it, to bury it, to awaken it, and each had fallen, consumed not by gods nor by war but by the weight of remembrance too vast for mortals to bear. And Jorund screamed though no sound escaped, his mind tearing beneath the flood, yet still the sphere poured into him until his eyes burned with light, until his veins throbbed with fire, until he was no longer Jorund alone but Jorund and all who had come before, kings and priests and slaves and sailors, their voices all within him, their memories all his. And when at last the flood ebbed and silence returned, he collapsed upon the pedestal, his chest heaving, his eyes hollow, his body trembling, and his men dared not approach, for they saw in him not their captain but something more, something other. And when he rose, slowly, his face pale yet his gaze burning with the light of 1,000 ages, he spoke words that were not wholly his own, his voice deeper, resonant, echoing with the chorus of memory. We are bound, we are burdened, we are endless, we carry. And at that the chamber shook, the guardians bowed their stone heads, and the whiteness beyond returned, swallowing the terrace, the sea, the sky, leaving only the pyramid and those upon it. And his men, trembling, whispered, "What are we now, Jorund? What curse have you taken?" But he only looked beyond them, his gaze distant, as though seeing not the world but its memory, and he said, "We are no longer voyagers, no longer raiders, no longer men. We are vessels, and what we carry is older than the world." And though fear clutched their hearts, though dread gnawed their souls, they followed still, for their oaths chained them, their fates bound them, and together they descended deeper into the pyramid, where the true heart of memory awaited. Where secrets not of men nor gods but of creation itself slept, guarded, buried, waiting to be awakened. And in that descent where no step was measured by stone nor distance but by the heaviness of the air itself, thick with the weight of all that had ever been thought, dreamed, remembered, or forgotten, Joran felt as though every beat of his heart echoed down corridors not carved by hands but by ages, and the deeper they went, the more the whiteness gave way to walls alive with shifting inscriptions, some flaring like molten gold, others whispering in shadows, until the chamber of the true heart revealed itself not as a room but as a vast cavern that seemed to stretch beyond the scale of the world, its ceiling arched like the dome of heaven itself, studded not with stars but with symbols that pulsed like constellations, each one alive, each one tethered to stories too ancient for words, and in the center lay the heart, no sphere this time but something vast, crystalline, a monolith rising from the ground like an inverted mountain, its surface glimmering with layers upon layers of visions, so that at one angle Joran saw oceans boiling with leviathans whose bones later became the hills of men. At another angle he saw fires that birthed cities long forgotten beneath the Nile and the Euphrates. And at another he saw faces of kings and queens, their crowns of gold turning to dust, their names swallowed by centuries. And as he approached, the relic burned in his chest so hot he feared his ribs might split. And his men staggered, clutching their heads, some vomiting, some crying out with voices that were not their own, for the heart was not silent, it sang, though its song was not of melody but of remembrance, a resonance that forced itself into the marrow of those who dared come near, and it was then Joran understood that all pyramids, all ziggurats, all stone circles across the world were but reflections of this place, poor shadows of the one vault where the first memory, the primal memory, had been sealed, and his thoughts reeled as the histories he had glimpsed before. Bronze-clad warriors, reed ships gliding under strange constellations, rivers cut to mirror the heavens, folded into still older visions, older than man himself, when the first beings of thought, either flesh nor spirit, had woven memory into matter, fearing the void's silence more than death itself, and they had left this heart as anchor, as seed, as curse, so that the world would never forget itself. And all who came after would be trapped in the cycle, guard, bury, awaken, and his men, trembling, cried that this was not for them, that they should flee before memory consumed them as it had consumed the empires before. But Joran, though his soul quaked, could not turn away, for in that crystalline mountain he saw his own face multiplied 1,000-fold, not as he was now but as he had been, as he might be, as countless others had been before, men and women across ages, all bound to the burden, all echoes of one chain, and when his trembling hand touched its surface the chamber convulsed, the light flared, and visions drowned him utterly, dragging him through eras like a man hurled through storms. He saw Sumerians laying brick upon brick to bury relics beneath temples whose foundations outlasted gods. He saw Egyptians carving pyramids not as tombs but as locks, each block an oath of memory. He saw the Indus Valley raising citadels whose drains carried whispers instead of water. He saw shamans in forests older than nations binding bones with runes. He saw Mayan priests painting blood upon stone steps that aligned with the stars not for harvests but for remembrance. He saw Celtic druids standing in circles of stone where voices of ages bled into the wind. He saw Chinese emperors burying terracotta hosts not for vanity but to weigh down memory itself. And further still he saw not men but giants whose names no saga carried, building mountains with their hands, sealing caverns where memory oozed like molten ore, and beyond them he saw shapes not even giant, but vast, formless, carving suns, bending seas, weaving the loom of existence, and through it all the same burden, the same whisper, guard, bury, awaken, and Joran screamed though no sound came, for he understood now that mankind was not the master of memory but its prisoner, that history itself was no chronicle of progress but a chain of guardians each failing in turn, each burying what could not stay buried, each awakening what they could not comprehend, and as his knees struck the ground he wept, not from fear alone but from the unbearable weight of knowing that every war ever fought, every empire ever risen, every monument ever raised was not for glory, nor for greed, but for this endless, ceaseless struggle to hold back the flood of remembrance, to bind creation's first echo. And as he lay there the heart pulsed once more, pouring into him faces of those who had borne it Gilgamesh staring at the walls of Uruk not in pride but despair for what he had failed to bury, Khufu sealing his pyramid not for death but for silence, Ashoka weeping as he carved edicts upon stone to keep memory veiled, Alexander burning libraries not from conquest but terror, Caesar staring into auguries he could not unsee, Christ crying out in the garden not for the cup of death but for the memory he too had glimpsed, and on, every name, every age, every burden, and Jorund, though broken, knew with dreadful clarity that he was now part of that line, not chosen but consumed, not free but bound, and his men, watching, fell into madness, some tearing at their skin as if to claw out visions, others striking their heads upon the stone to silence the whispers, one hurling himself into the abyss that opened at the chamber's edge, his scream echoing not downward but backward, as if time itself devoured him, and still Jorund rose, pale as bone, his eyes no longer his own but mirrors of the heart. And he spoke words older than Norse, older than Sumerian, older than tongue itself, and though his men did not understand, their souls quivered, for the words were not for them but for the memory, and at his utterance the heart flared, its light shattering the cavern into 1,000 mirrored shards, each reflecting not what was but what had been, so that in one shard they saw Troy burn, in another Atlantis sink, in another Carthage salt its own soil, in another Jerusalem weep. In another kingdoms of Africa rise and fall unrecorded, in another tribes wander endless steps, in another the ice swallow whole peoples, and through it all the same pattern, guard, bury, awaken, and the heart spoke at last, not in sound but in thought, its voice a chorus of ages, saying, "You are vessel, you are chain, you are burden, and you will carry until the end of ends." And Jorund, trembling, whispered, "And when the end comes?" And the heart answered, "There is no end, only memory, for even death remembers." And in that truth Jorund felt despair deeper than the sea. For he knew now there would be no release, no salvation, only the endless carrying of what was too vast to carry. And yet even in despair a fire burned, for if he must bear it, then he would not flee, he would not falter. And though his men cried out that they were lost, that this place had unmade them, Jorund turned to them, his voice ragged but fierce, and he said, "We are not the first, we will not be the last, but we will endure. For to turn away is only to pass the burden heavier to those who come after, and if fate has chained us here, then let it be said that we bore it as men, not as cowards." And his words, though hollow against the roar of memory, steadied them, and together, broken though they were, they descended further into the chamber where the heart beat not with light but with silence, the silence of creation itself, waiting, waiting to be awakened, and deeper still they went, though no stair carried them, no slope bore their weight, for the chamber of silence did not descend in measures of stone but in degrees of surrender, each step stripping from them the remnants of themselves, so that with every breath Jorund felt less the man he had been and more the vessel the heart demanded, and the silence was not absence but density, a silence so thick it pressed upon the lungs, crushed the marrow, thundered louder than the roar of battle, and as they entered the true hollow, vast as the bones of the world itself, they beheld not symbols nor visions now but the raw matter of memory unformed, a void trembling with shapes unborn, as though creation itself had once pooled here before it was spilled into rivers of time, and Jorund knew, as surely as he had ever known cold wind on the fjord, that this was the womb from which all myth had first crawled, and the grave to which all would return, and his men, staggering like drunkards, cried that this place was death, yet Jorund whispered hoarsely, "No, it is before death, before life, before all." And as he spoke the silence shifted, rippled, and from the void rose pillars not carved but coalesced, obsidian black yet veined with fire, 12 in number, standing in a circle vast enough to dwarf mountains, and upon them were etched not runes of men but lines of force that seemed to shift as one gazed, becoming scripts of Sumer, hieroglyphs of Nile, strokes of Indus, glyphs of Maya, knots of Inca, Agam of Druids, each language reflecting itself as if all tongues were one tongue fractured. And the men dropped to their knees, not from reverence but from the unbearable gravity of it, for the pillars radiated not heat, not light, but history itself, so condensed it blistered the skin, and in their presence the heart within Jorund's chest beat not as flesh but as one with the monolith above, its rhythm sinking, booming, until it was no longer his own but the world's, and suddenly the silence cracked. Not into sound but into visions poured upon them like floodwater. They saw Ur rise from mudbrick, its ziggurats crowned with fire that licked the stars, only to crumble beneath storms summoned by memory unchained. They saw Giza's stones pulled across deserts not by slaves but by oath-bound guardians who sang to each block as if each were a coffin for secrets. They saw Mayan calendars close upon themselves, not to mark endings of worlds but to reset the locks of memory once more. They saw priests on forgotten isles chanting in tongues no man had spoken for 10,000 years, burying obsidian idols into trenches that smoked with salt and blood, all for the same purpose: guard, bury, awaken. And across every vision Joran saw himself, not himself but echoes of himself. Men and women carrying the relic, carrying the burden, chained by the same curse, and he wept though no tears fell, for in this chamber even grief was swallowed, and when the visions passed the silence deepened until their ears bled with its pressure, and the pillars trembled as though struck by some force outside the world, and from their circle rose a 13th figure, not a pillar but a throne, black as void, etched with veins of starlight, and upon it sat a shape cloaked in shadow, featureless, ageless. Yet when it lifted its head Joran felt as though all his ancestors stared through that darkness, every face, every eye, every forgotten breath gazing upon him, and the figure spoke, though its voice was neither man's nor God's but the silence itself breaking, saying, "Vessel of the North, you have come as others came, you will bear as others bore, you will fall as others fell, and the chain will tighten." And Joran, trembling but unbowed, asked, "Who are you?" And the figure answered, "I am the custodian, the shadow left when the first memory was cut from. Void, I am not life nor death, but the hand that locks and the hand that buries." And Joran said, "Then free me." And the custodian laughed, not in mockery but in pity, saying, "Freedom is the lie men tell to endure the burden. There is no free, only carry, only bury, only awaken." And Joran fell to his knees, the weight crushing him. But as he bowed his eyes fell upon the throne's base, and there he saw carvings, scenes of ages not yet lived, of ships with sails of iron crossing seas of glass, of towers piercing the clouds, of fires that burn not with wood but with the hearts of stars, of men walking beneath moons that were not their own, and he understood with terror that memory did not end with him, nor with his sons, nor their sons, but stretched into futures where burdens would grow heavier still, and the custodian, seeing his gaze, whispered, "Even they will fail, even they will bury, even they will awaken, for the chain is eternal." And Joran roared though his voice cracked, "Then let me break it!" And at his defiance the cavern shook, the pillars blazed, the heart above flared so bright it seared flesh from bone, and the silence screamed, and his men fell prostrate, begging, weeping, clawing at the ground, while Joran stood alone, defiant, burning, his hands lifted to the monolith as if to wrench it from its root, and the custodian rose, its cloak unfurling into wings of shadow that blotted the cavern, and it said, "Then prove you are more than vessel, more than echo, prove you are not prisoner but breaker." And with that the silence shattered, and the chamber became storm, and visions poured upon him so violently he staggered, yet he did not fall, for within his breast the relic burned not with despair but with fury, and he cried, "If the chain is eternal, then let me be the hammer." And as he struck his hand upon the heart, the crystalline mountain fractured, light spilling like rivers, and from its wound burst voices not of past but of future. Screaming, crying, whispering, 1,000 unborn ages clamoring at once, and Joran knew he had not freed them but unleashed them, and as the heart wailed, the custodian's shadow screamed, and the pillars collapsed, and the void itself cracked open like an egg, spilling darkness brighter than light, and the men were hurled into its maw, lost, devoured, forgotten, while Joran, clinging to the relic in his chest, was flung upward, upward, through visions, through silence, through fire, until he no longer knew if he rose or fell, only that the chain now wrapped him tighter than flesh, tighter than soul, and as he drifted in the storm of memory he heard the voice again, faint, echoing, "Guard, bury, awaken! Guard, bury, awaken!" Joran felt his being scatter like grains in a gale, his bones no longer bones, his flesh no longer flesh, but threads woven into the tapestry of remembrance itself, each fiber tugged by unseen hands, each knot tied by ages that had lived and fallen long before. His name was ever spoken, and as he spun within that storm he saw not the world as men see it, bounded by earth and sea, but the world as memory held it, vast, unbroken, stretching from the first fire struck in caves to the last ember yet to be born upon stars, and through it all the same refrain, endless, ceaseless, guard, bury, awaken, until the words themselves became the loom of reality. The law by which rivers bent their courses and mountains folded their stone, and Jorund, though torn near to dissolution, clung with all the will left in him, for in the depths of the maelstrom he felt the relic within his chest pulse, not in surrender but in defiance, and he seized that beat as a man seizes rope amidst the sea, drawing himself from the torrent until the vision stilled, and he found himself standing, not on cavern floor, not in void, but upon a plain endless and black, lit only by pillars of fire rising from cracks in the earth, and upon each pillar danced shadows that were not flame but figures, warriors clad in bronze and gold, priests in white linen, kings with crowns of feathers and jade, shamans draped in hides, all faces of ages past, all gazing upon him as witness, and the plains stretched beyond sight until the horizon curved not into sky but into memory itself, as though the world he knew was but a shard broken from this greater field. And in the silence between the flames he heard voices speaking in tongues of Babylon, of Thebes, of forgotten Vinca and lost Olmec, all merging into a single cadence. You are bound, as they were bound, as those after shall be bound. And Jorund, though his knees shook, raised his head and roared, If I am bound, then tell me why. Tell me who forged this chain. And at his cry the shadows swelled, their forms towering, shifting, until from their mass strode 12 figures vast as Titans, their faces hidden in helms of stone, their bodies draped in robes stitched with constellations, and they encircled him as the pillars had in the chamber, their steps shaking the plain as though mountains moved, and one, whose helm bore the horns of the bull, thundered, We are the architects, who first cut memory from the void, who sealed it in stone and flesh, who bore the burden so creation would not fall to silence. And another, whose helm bore the wings of the hawk, said, But we fell, as all fall, for no vessel holds forever, and so the chain passes, unbroken, unending. And Jorund, clenching his fists, spat, Then it was you who cursed us, who made us prisoners of remembrance. And the third, crowned with stars, answered, We did not curse, we preserved. Without memory all would unravel, rivers forget their course. Suns their fire, flesh its shape, thought its birth. Memory is the spine of being, but the spine must be carried, and in carrying it bends, and in bending it breaks, and in breaking it remakes, forever. And Jorund cried, Then let it break and end. Let silence swallow all if it means the chain is broken. And the 12 shuddered, as if in grief, and the one with serpent helm spoke. Such words were spoken before, by Gilgamesh, who sought immortality to defy the burden, and failed. By Khufu, who raised stone to bury what could not be buried, and failed. By Qin Huang, who sought eternity through clay and mercury, and failed. By Alexander, who sought to burn memory from the earth, and failed. By priests who drowned it in blood, by emperors who carved it in law, by prophets who veiled it in parable, all failed, for the chain is stronger than will, stronger than life, stronger than death. And Jorund, his eyes blazing though his body quaked, said, Then let me be the first to succeed. And at those words the plain convulsed, the pillars of fire bent, the shadows writhed, and the architects, towering, drew back, for his defiance was flame unchained, and from the cracks of the earth rose visions once more, but not of past this time, of ships with dragon prows cutting across seas not of water but of stars, of warriors with runes etched upon their skin battling beneath skies of moons uncounted, of towers of glass rising above oceans that boiled with machines, of graves unmarked beneath ruins of steel. And Jorund realized with horror and awe that memory did not stop at history but devoured future as well, that all ages yet unborn were already bound to the same chain, already prisoners of the same burden, and his cry turned from defiance to anguish, for he saw his own sons sailing west into unknown waters not for conquest nor trade but because the memory compelled them. Because across the ocean waited locks yet unturned, vaults yet unbroken, guardians yet unslain, and he fell to his knees, whispering, The burden will follow them, as it followed me, as it followed all before. And the architects, solemn, intoned, So it must, for to bear memory is to be human, and to be human is to carry the weight of what was, what is, and what will be. But Jorund, shaking, raised his face streaked with ash and said, Then I will not carry it quietly. If I must be vessel, I will be vessel of fire, not silence. If I must guard, I will guard with fury. If I must bury, I will bury with storm. If I must awaken, I will awaken with war. And at his oath the plain split open, the fire roared, the shadows screamed, and the architects and Jorund was hurled backward, upward, through flame, through shadow, through visions, until the plain was gone, the architects gone, the pillars gone, and he found himself once more adrift in the storm of memory, but no longer as prey, no longer as prisoner, for the relic within his breast burned brighter than the storm itself, and he roared. If the chain is eternal, then I will be its breaker. If memory is cursed, then I will be its flame. And his voice rang across the void like thunder, so loud it woke echoes of echoes, so loud it stirred ages not yet born, and the storm bent around him, recoiling, folding, as though even the chain trembled at his fury, yet still the whisper endured, softer now but unbroken, guard, bury, awaken, guard, bury, awaken, and as it faded into the marrow of his bones, Jorund felt the storm deliver him not to cavern nor plain, but to shore, his feet striking sand wet with tide, the sky above not the cavern ceiling but open, infinite, stars wheeling like runes across black velvet, and in the distance, across the sea, he saw the glimmer of lands unknown, waiting, calling, and he knew, with dread and fire alike, that the burden was not ended but only carried forward, across waters no Viking had yet sailed, to secrets sleeping beyond the horizon. Secrets that would awaken when his blood, and his son's blood, touched their shores, and the secrets that would awaken when his blood, and his son's blood, touched their shores lingered in Jorund's mind like a curse etched upon the marrow, for as he stood upon that desolate strand beneath the wheeling stars, the wind that swept from the sea carried whispers not of surf but of voices older than the tides themselves, voices that spoke in fragments, in echoes, in forgotten names, Atlantis, Mu, Hyperborea. Names he did not know yet felt carved into his soul as though he had once uttered them, in lifetimes unremembered, and his heart burned with the knowledge that the voyage before him would not be measured in leagues nor moons but in memories chained beneath waves, and as his men stumbled ashore, coughing salt and trembling from visions still gnawing at their flesh, he saw in their eyes the same fire, the same terror, for they too had glimpsed fragments of the burden that awaited beyond the horizon. And they knew without words that this shore was but a threshold, not an end, and that the relic within Jorund's chest had not guided them here for rest but for passage, for it throbbed like a second heart, pulling not landward but seaward, as though the ocean itself were a gate waiting to be forced. And so Jorund commanded that the longship be made whole again, its timbers straightened, its sails mended, though the wood moaned with every stroke as if it too had borne the visions of the chamber, and resented its fate. Yet they labored, for to remain upon this strange shore was death, not from hunger or blade but from the silence of the place, for no bird sang, no beast stirred, the very earth seemed to sleep, and the men muttered that perhaps they stood upon one of the isles the old skalds had whispered of, where gods had walked and then departed, leaving behind nothing but silence too deep for mortals to endure, and Jorund, though his blood chilled at the thought, forbade despair, saying, "The burden does not allow us to die here, it drives us forward, and forward we must go, lest we rot as prisoners of its shore." And they obeyed, for his voice had in it a resonance not wholly his own but touched by the storm he had endured, and after many suns and moons they set forth again, their dragon-headed prow cutting into seas that seemed vaster than any fjord-born man had ever dreamed, and as they sailed the stars shifted above them in patterns unfamiliar, constellations that bore no names in their tongue, as though they had crossed not merely waters, but the very skin of the world. And the deeper they went, the stranger the sea became, its waves rising not with storm but with breath, rolling in rhythms that felt alive, and at night the depths glowed with lights not of fish but of runes etched in currents themselves, great spirals that burned for moments then sank, and the men whispered of Jormungandr, the world serpent, stirring beneath, but Jorund, clutching his chest, knew it was not serpent but memory, seeping even through the waters. For in dreams he saw drowned cities, their columns broken, their streets paved with coral and bone, their temples sealed by silt yet still pulsing with the rhythm of the chain. And when he woke his hands were wet with salt though no wave had touched him, and he feared that the sea itself was testing them, stripping from them all certainty, until at last, after days uncounted, land rose upon the horizon. not green with forests nor gold with sands but jagged black, a land of cliffs and stone. Carved into shapes too deliberate to be natural, spires that pointed skyward like fingers accusing the heavens, arches that framed the sea as if gates for forgotten kings, and the men trembled, for the air itself seemed thick, not with mist but with memory, and their ears rang as though invisible horns were sounding, heralding their arrival, and as they drew near the shore they saw carvings upon the rock. Not runes of their fathers but marks older, vast spirals, eyes unblinking, lions that twisted upon themselves like serpents devouring their tails, and Joran knew without knowing that this was no mere land but a vault, a lock set upon the chain, and as their ship scraped upon the stones the relic within his chest blazed, so bright the men fell back blinded, and the cliffs before them shuddered, splitting, revealing a cavern vast as a hall of gods, its ceiling lined with crystals that glowed like a false sky, casting upon the waters the light of a dawn never meant for men, and Joran, seizing spear and shield, cried, "This is why we came! Not for gold, not for glory, but because the burden demands it! Forward!" And though his men wept they obeyed, for they were bound as he was, and they dragged their ship into the hollow, and as they entered the cavern the sea behind them sealed, cliffs grinding closed as if the very land wished to swallow them, and darkness deeper than night engulfed them, broken only by the faint glow of the relic in Joran's chest, and the deeper they went the more the cavern revealed itself, not cave but hall. Its walls etched with carvings of ships not of wood but of stone, sails of fire, oars of bone, fleets stretching across oceans not of water but of stars, and Joran shuddered to see that upon every prow stood figures bearing relics like his own, their chests alight, their faces solemn, and beneath them endless waves of symbols repeating the same command in 1,000 tongues, "Guard, bury, awaken," and his men fell silent, for they knew now they were not first, not pioneers but inheritors, heirs of a voyage that had never ended, and as they passed deeper into the hall they came upon a stair, not carved but grown, steps of black stone that pulsed faintly with each tread, as though they were ascending not stone but spine, the very backbone of some forgotten titan, and at the summit stood a door, vast, seamless, carved with 12 circles interlocked, and at its center a 13th, unmarked save for a hollow the size of the relic burning within Joran's breast, and his men fell to their knees, begging him to turn back, but Joran, trembling yet resolute, pressed his chest against the hollow, and as the relic touched stone the door shuddered, screaming like metal wrenched from the earth, and it split, revealing a chamber vast and cold, and within it lay not treasure but a throne, upon which sat a figure robed in gold yet blackened by ages, its flesh gone to dust, its skull crowned with a circlet of obsidian. And in its withered hands rested a tablet of stone etched with runes older than all runes, glowing faintly, and as Joran stepped forward the skull's hollow eyes flared with light, and a voice, not sound but thought, filled the chamber, saying, "You have come, bearer of the chain, as all before you came, as all after will come, to take the record, to bear the memory, to guard, to bury, to awaken." And Joran, though his soul quailed, cried, "Then tell me the end! Tell me how to break it!" But the voice only laughed, not cruel but weary, saying, "There is no end, only beginning upon beginning, echo upon echo, memory upon memory, and you are but another vessel, another echo, another flame to guard the darkness." And the chamber shook as if with sorrow, and Joran fell to his knees, the weight of ages crushing him, yet still he clutched his chest and roared, "If I must carry it, I will carry it in defiance. If I must guard, I will guard with fury. If I must bury, I will bury with storm. If I must awaken, I will awaken with war." And at his cry the throne cracked, the tablet split, and the cavern roared as though the sea itself had been loosed, and his men screamed as waves of memory poured from the broken stone, visions of drowned empires, of forgotten kings, of wars fought not for land but for silence itself, and Joran, burning with fire not his own, seized the shards of the tablet, feeling them melt into his flesh, carving into his bones. And he knew with dread and exultation that the burden had deepened, that he was no longer vessel alone but scribe, bearer not just of memory but of record, and the voice whispered, fading, "So it begins again, so it begins anew, guard, bury, awaken." And the chamber collapsed, stone crashing like thunder, sea surging like fury, and Joran and his men were swept into darkness, hurled once more into the storm of memory, their fates bound tighter still, their voyage not ended but carried forward into the vast unknown. Toward shores yet unseen, toward secrets yet unburied, toward awakenings yet to shatter the world. And toward awakenings yet to shatter the world the current bore them, tumbling through a darkness neither sea nor sky, a chasm between realms where light itself seemed afraid to dwell, and as Joran gasped for breath, clutching at broken timbers of their shattered ship, he realized they were not drowning though waves engulfed them, for this was no ordinary water but the flood of memory itself, dense, luminous, and alive, carrying them as leaves upon a river whose source and mouth were older than creation, and within its tides he glimpsed shapes vast and terrible, cities swallowed whole yet still standing, their spires leaning in silence, fleets of ships with prows shaped like beasts unknown, their oars unmoving, their crews frozen in amber-like stasis as if they had sailed from one age into another and never arrived, temples of stone rising from abyssal plains where no sun could ever shine, lit by fires that burned without flame, guarded by statues whose eyes shifted with a gaze that seemed to pierce him, and as he stared, trembling, he saw upon the currents scrolls of gold unfurling, upon them inscribed histories in tongues he could not speak yet understood, wars waged by gods before men were born, floods sent not by chance but by design, chains forged across worlds to bind not beasts but memories themselves. And Joran cried out as the torrent tore at his mind, each vision carving into him like a blade, each truth heavier than the weight of stone, and still the relic within his chest burned like an anchor, keeping him from dissolution, tethering him to flesh when all else sought to strip him into fragments of recollection, and he clung, teeth gritted, until at last the torrent spat them forth, casting them upon a shore so strange it seemed not of earth but of dream, for the sand was black as obsidian yet glittered with flecks of light like stars crushed beneath their feet. And the sea behind them roared not with surf but with voices, whispers rising and falling like chants in 1,000 forgotten tongues, and above stretched a sky not blue nor gray but shifting, painted with hues of violet and gold, constellations swirling in patterns that writhed and broke, as though the heavens themselves had been shattered and rewoven in haste, and Joran, crawling upon hands and knees, lifted his gaze to behold what lay beyond the strand, and his breath failed him. For towering before them upon cliffs that rose like walls of giants stood ruins not of stone but of metal, vast towers twisted and broken, their surfaces carved with lines that glowed faintly, as if veins of fire still pulsed within though the age of their making was long past, and among them loomed statues whose heads were shattered, whose bodies were sundered, yet whose scale dwarfed even mountains. And though weathered by ages untold they bore crowns of design unlike any men had ever forged. Spirals and circles interlocked, the very echo of the sigils he had seen upon the vault, and Joran knew with a terror deeper than the sea that this place was no mere owl but the carcass of an age, a civilization greater than all he had ever known, drowned not in sea but in silence, and now unearthed by the burden of the chain. His men staggered beside him, pale as ghosts, their eyes wide with dread, and one whispered, "Atlantis," though none among them had ever been taught the name, and Joran, though his heart quaked, rose to his feet, saying, "Not Atlantis, not by the name men give it in tales, but by the truth it bore before tales were spun. This is one of the first, perhaps the first, where memory was bound in flesh and stone alike, where the chain was hammered and set." And as he spoke the ground beneath them trembled, as if the owl itself stirred at being named, and cracks split the black sand, spilling light as though molten gold coursed beneath, and from the cliffs above came a sound not of falling stone but of horns, long and low, sounding across the ruins, and Joran's men fell upon their knees in terror, crying that gods had awoken, but Joran clenched his fists and strode forward, saying, "If gods awake, then let them speak, for I will no longer crawl." In silence, and he led them across the strand, up paths carved by no mortal hand, through archways half buried in dust, into streets once trod by feet that had shaped empires greater than dream. Everywhere they walked they saw remnants of lives long ended, streets lined with broken tablets, carvings of beasts that bore wings of stone and eyes of gems, doorways so vast entire halls could pass through them, and upon the walls runes repeating the same triad, guard, bury, awaken, but inscribed not in one tongue but in dozens, spiraling across surfaces until they tangled like roots. And deeper still they found halls where water pooled like mirrors, upon whose surfaces danced visions of times past, processions of kings clad in feathered cloaks, sacrifices made to idols that burned with living flame, fleets departing into seas not of water but of light, their sails filled with winds from stars themselves. And Joran's men wept, for the visions burned their eyes, but Joran pressed forward, guided not by sight but by the relic within his chest, which pulsed brighter with each step, as though the isle itself called to it, as though the memory bound within the island recognized the fragment bound within him. At last they came to a plaza vast and circular, its floor inlaid with patterns of gold and obsidian that formed a spiral reaching toward a pedestal at its heart, and upon that pedestal rested a sphere of crystal blacker than night, yet within it swirled galaxies of light, stars collapsing and birthing, empires rising and falling, lives flaring and fading, and Joran staggered as he beheld it. For he realized this was not artifact alone but archive, memory not in fragments but in totality, the sum of all that had been chained, sealed within crystal when worlds drowned and cities burned, preserved so that nothing would ever truly die. And as he stepped forward the sphere flared, and from its depths rose a figure not of flesh but of flame, tall as the tallest mast, crowned with fire, cloaked in shadow, its voice thundering in the marrow of their bones. You come as others came, bound to the chain, vessel of burden, seeker of end. But there is no end. Only bearing. Only passing. Only awakening. And Joran, though his knees threatened to buckle, shouted, Then why guard it? Why bury it? Why force us to awaken it if it is only curse? And the figure of flame lifted arms that burned like suns, saying, Because without memory, being unravels. Without burden, flesh dissolves into void. To guard is to preserve. To bury is to endure. To awaken is to begin anew. The chain is not curse but law. But Joran bared his teeth, roaring, Then let law break! Let silence claim all! Better void than bondage! And at his words the sphere convulsed, the plaza shuddered, cracks racing across the spiral, and the figure of flame bent low, whispering in tones like molten stone. So spoke the last who stood where you stand. So spoke the kings of drowned isles, the emperors of burning sands, the prophets who fled into wilderness. All sought to end. All failed. Will you fail as well, son of storms? And Joran, clutching his chest as the relic burned like fire within, bellowed, If I fail, it will not be in silence but in fire. And he hurled his spear at the sphere, its tip striking with thunder, shattering the crystal into fragments that flew like meteors across the plaza. And the figure of flame screamed as though torn from its vessel, vanishing in a burst of light that blinded them all. The ground split, towers collapsed, the sea roared, and from the ruins rose not silence but voices, countless voices, echoing as if freed from prison, whispering guard, bury, awaken not in unison but in chaos, each tongue a different age, a different memory, swirling around them until the very air seemed a storm of recollection, and Joran fell to his knees, clutching his head, crying out as visions consumed him. Visions of shores yet unseen, of voyages yet unmade, of his sons and their sons, of worlds rising and falling not by fate but by burden, and he realized with terror that in shattering the sphere he had not broken the chain but loosed it, unbound it, set memory free to spread beyond walls, beyond vaults, beyond seas, into every vessel of flesh that would come after, and the voices roared in his skull until he thought his mind would break, yet through it all he clung to one truth, that he had chosen. That if the chain could not be broken, it could at least be defied, carried not in silence but in flame. And as the ruins crumbled around them, as the sea swallowed the plaza, Joran rose, his eyes burning with fire not his own, and he shouted above the roar, Then let it be carried! Let it burn! If I must guard, I will guard with fury. If I must bury, I will bury with storm. If I must awaken, I will awaken with war! And his voice thundered across the ruins like the breaking of worlds, and the isles sank beneath waves of fire and shadow, casting them once more into the storm of memory, their voyage not ended but only begun, carried forward into realms yet darker, toward awakenings yet fiercer, toward secrets that even the drowned had dared not speak. And toward secrets that even the drowned had dared not speak, the tide bore Joran and his surviving men into a night without horizon, a night where the sea was not water but molten memory, churning with shapes of ages that had perished before men learned to strike flint for fire, and as their shattered vessel groaned under currents unseen, Joran clung to the relic blazing within his breast. the only beacon in that abyss where stars themselves seemed to avert their gaze, and he felt with every beat that he was no longer merely a man but a vessel crammed with echoes too vast for flesh, his veins coursing with centuries, his skull rattling with tongues not his own, until he thought he would split apart like a rotten hull. Yet still he held, for he knew that surrender would mean dissolution into the chain, to become another whisper lost in the chant of guard, bury, awaken, and though his men moaned and cursed and wept, some tearing at their ears as the tide of voices grew louder, Jorund bellowed above the roar. Stand, sons of the north! Stand though the sea be fire, though the sky be void, for we are not the first nor shall we be the last to walk this path, and if the burden slays us then let it slay warriors, not cowards! And his cry seemed to carve space amidst the tide, as though the storm itself grudgingly acknowledged his defiance, and through that fissure he glimpsed a shape looming ahead, not island, not ship, but something vaster, columns of stone that rose from the deep like ribs of a dead god, their surfaces inscribed with runes larger than mountains, glowing faintly as if starlight itself had been trapped within them, and as they drew near the waves stilled, the voices hushed, and even the relic in Jorun's breast quieted, as though they approached the source from which all memory bled, the wellspring of the chain itself. His men trembled, whispering that they had come to the gates of hell, that no mortal was meant to look upon such a place, but Jorund gritted his teeth and said, If hell guards it, then we will tear her gates asunder, for no gate shall bind us. And he seized an oar, steering their half-broken ship into the colonnade. As they passed between the first pillars, light flared across their surfaces, runes igniting like veins of fire, and the sea below them turned to glass, so that they seemed to glide upon a mirror that reflected not their faces but the faces of countless dead, warriors in bronze, kings in diadems of jade, priests daubed in blood, maidens crowned with flowers, all staring upward from beneath the glass as if trapped forever beneath that frozen sea. Some of his men cried out, recognizing ancestors among the faces, though such a thing was impossible, and they covered their eyes, but Jorund forced himself to stare, whispering, So this is the truth, no soul escapes, no deed forgotten, all bound, all chained. And with each word the faces rippled, as though acknowledging his recognition. At last the pillars ended, and before them yawned a vast platform of stone, round as the moon, rising from the mirror sea, and upon it stood an edifice that dwarfed all temples men had ever raised, a ziggurat of black stone ascending in tiers, each tier carved with reliefs of civilizations lost, stacked one upon the other in an unbroken chain, and at its summit blazed a flame not of fire but of memory itself, white and gold, coiling upward like a serpent into the void above. His men refused to step upon the platform, falling to their knees in terror, but Jorund leapt ashore, his boots striking stone carved with sigils that writhed like living serpents, and as his foot touched the surface he felt his mind reel, for the ziggurat was not merely stone but archive, each tier a vault of centuries, each relief not carving but memory sealed in rock, and as he looked he saw them move. The Sumerian priests raising ziggurats beneath burning suns, the Egyptians carving their dead into eternity, the Mayan kings offering blood beneath eclipses, the Norse skalds chanting by firelight, and all of them turned their faces toward him, eyes hollow yet knowing, as though they had awaited his coming since the first stone was laid. Jorund staggered but pressed forward, drawn upward by the relic pulsing with unbearable heat in his chest, for it called to the flame at the summit as iron calls to magnet, as kin to kin. He climbed, each step heavier than the last, each tier showing him another drowned world, Indus cities swallowed by rivers, Hittite fortresses burning, Rome crumbling into dust, and with each vision his men behind him wailed, some falling senseless, some clawing at their skin as though to peel away memories not their own, until at last only a handful staggered in his wake, eyes hollow, their strength bound to his by terror or faith. At the summit he beheld the flame, no mere fire but a vortex of light, swirling with images of all that was, is, and might yet be, its tendrils reaching skyward into constellations that bent like chains across the heavens, and as he approached it thundered without sound, and from its depths emerged forms vast and terrible, the architects, 12 once more, but here not cloaked in shadow nor veiled in illusion, but radiant. Their helms of stone blazing with starlight, their robes woven of nebulae, each vast enough to shatter mountains, and they spoke in unison, their voices shaking the marrow of his bones. You have come where none should tread, bearer of burden, breaker of vaults, looser of chains. Why do you rise to the source? And Jorund, his voice raw but unbending, cried, because the burden hunts me, because no sea nor sky nor grave will release me, because you forged the chain and I will not bow unless I know why it was forged. At this the architects trembled, and one, crowned with flames, said, it was forged because silence is worse than weight, because void is worse than memory, because without the chain the universe would fall into forgetting, and forgetting is death absolute. But Jorund roared, and what of choice? What of freedom? What of men who never asked to bear your curse? You enslave us in the name of preservation, but preservation without will is torment, not life. And the one crowned with stars answered, so spake those before, and so shall those after speak, but know this, the chain is older than us, older than gods, older than worlds. We did not forge it, we only bound it, we only bore it until it bent us into dust. It is law, not curse, and law does not ask. And Jorund, trembling with fury, thrust his hand against his chest, where the relic blazed like a star about to shatter, and he cried, then let me be the law's end! And he flung himself into the flame. His men shrieked, some fleeing, some falling dead from the shock, but Jorund did not burn. He dissolved, his flesh unraveling into threads of light, his bones scattering into sparks, his eyes collapsing into visions, until he was no longer man but memory itself, flowing into the flame, swelling it until the whole ziggurat blazed with unbearable radiance, and the architects drew back, shielding their eyes though they were greater than mountains. For Jorund's defiance was now woven into the chain, his cry echoing not as whisper but as roar. If I must carry, I will carry in fire. If I must guard, I will guard with fury. If I must bury, I will bury with storm. If I must awaken, I will awaken with war. And the chain trembled across the heavens, constellations breaking, stars shuddering, seas roaring upon distant shores, and men and beasts alike waking in terror with words they could not know burning upon their tongues, guard, bury, awaken. And far across oceans not yet sailed, and lands not yet named by the north, fires flared in jungles, idols wept tears of stone, mountains split to reveal vaults of gold, as if the whole earth had felt his oath, as if the whole burden had shifted upon his shoulders, and though he was gone as flesh, his men who survived staggered from the platform into their ship, their eyes hollow, whispering his name not as comrade but as curse and prayer alike, and the sea bore them away once more into night, toward shores that waited, toward awakenings that would carve themselves into history not as myth but as truth, the truth that the chain was unbroken yet not unchallenged, that one Viking, son of storms, had dared to defy eternity, and in defiance had set the world upon a path from which it would never return. And so when Jorund vanished into the storm of remembrance, scattered into flame and oath, the world did not release him but rather reshaped itself in his image, for across the oceans that no Viking had yet mapped, the pulse of his defiance stirred lands waiting like sleepers beneath blankets of forest and mountain, and in those lands, unknown to the Norse but ancient in their own rights, elders already whispered of chains in the sky and fire beneath the earth, so that when the first dragon proud ships cut the western mist generations later, it was not conquest alone that arrived but prophecy meeting prophecy, curse clasping curse, and in the villages of Vinland the native seers trembled at the sight of pale-haired strangers, not because they were foreign, but because their coming had been sung in riddles long before, riddles of men bearing fragments of fire, fragments of burden, fragments of memory. And thus the saga uncoiled further, each voyage westward not a discovery but a remembering, as though the sea itself compelled the Vikings to fulfill what Jorund had begun, a thread tugging them across waters toward shores that recognized them before they even landed, and the secrets they carried were not trinkets of trade, not iron blades or amber beads, but dreams they did not understand, dreams of serpent temples half buried in vines, of masks carved with eyes too wide for men, of vaults sealed with stone where fire did not burn but hummed, and when they woke sweating in their tents they told each other it was nothing, the madness of salt and sleep, yet still when they walked the forests they found stones cut by hands older than their memory, patterns like runes yet not runes, spirals that whispered in winds, and though they could not name it, their hearts pounded with the same refrain that had swallowed Jorund, guard, bury, awaken, and each time they struck axe to tree, each time they raised timber halls on alien soil, the land seemed to watch, as though testing if they were worthy to unlock what slept beneath. For what the Vikings carried across the oceans was not just the hunger of conquest but the weight of an oath their chieftain had roared into eternity, an oath that did not die with him but infected their blood, and through them it infected the lands they touched. So that centuries later, when ships from Iberia came bearing cross and cannon, they too stepped into a stage already cursed. A theater already lit by Joran's fire, and though they believed they brought new gods, new tongues, new empires, they were merely players in a drama older than their faith, drawn west not by chance but by the same unseen chain, the same architects who had watched and waited, and even as civilizations fell in fire and blood, the true secret endured, buried in stone crypts beneath forests, in caverns beneath cliffs, in runes etched where no man yet dared decipher. And the flame of memory whispered still, promising that one day, when the seas had been fully crossed, when every horizon had been swallowed, the burden would awaken once more, not as story, not as dream, but as reckoning. The oceans whispered with storms that had no end, and across those haunted waters where the stars themselves flickered like broken embers of a sky too old to hold its light, the echoes of Joran's oath still pulsed, rippling through ages and lands as if the whole earth had taken his defiance into its bones. And so it was that centuries after his flame dissolved into the vortex of memory, the burden did not rest but instead seeped like blood through the veins of time, calling not only to his kinsmen of the north but to every tribe, every people who gazed upon the horizon and felt that there was something waiting beyond it, something older than their gods. And thus in the sagas of the Norse the westward voyages became not just raids or wanderings but visions driven by forces they could not name, for though their hands grasped for timber, iron, and plunder, their dreams were plagued by the same refrain Joran had roared, "Guard, bury, awaken," and when the dragon's ships split the mists and reached the unknown forests of Vinland, they believed themselves conquerors, yet the land met them not as virgin but as keeper. For beneath the green canopy lay stones inscribed by hands lost to time, spirals and symbols humming with the same resonance as the runes of their ancestors, though no Viking mouth could sound them. And the native seers who watched from shadows trembled not because strangers had arrived but because they recognized the fire they carried, the burden etched into their very blood, a fire they had long prophesied would return across the sea, not as gift nor curse alone but as test. And thus the sagas of the north and the prophecies of the west braided together, each thread leading toward a reckoning deeper than conquest, deeper than settlement, a reckoning that turned men into vessels of memory itself. And so the Vikings carried not just steel and flame but the echoes of Joran's vow. A vow that had stirred even mountains to shift and idols to weep, and those echoes seeped into every axe stroke, every hall they raised, every grave mound they built, until the very soil of Vinland seemed restless, whispering beneath their feet, promising that what was buried would not remain so forever. For the architects still watched, unseen, waiting, their constellations bending like chains across the night sky, each link trembling with the weight of history, each star burning with defiance and doom. And though the Norse knew nothing of such celestial laws, they felt it in their marrow, a heaviness that no mead could drown, a pressure that no prayer could ease. And so their children dreamed of serpent temples wrapped in vines, of rivers that sang with voices older than the world, of caverns where flames hummed like heartbeats, and when they woke they hid their terror behind laughter, behind boasts, behind the clang of iron, yet still the land answered their unspoken dread with relics rising from the soil. Bones of cities older than time, masks carved, with eyes too wide, too knowing, eyes that seemed to watch them from both sides of life and death. And though they told themselves it was coincidence, though they mocked their own unease, they carried the truth across the oceans as surely as they carried their axes, the truth that their voyages were not discoveries but remembrances, not beginnings but continuations, for the chain Joran had defied still coiled around them, binding them not to their past alone but to the future of every people who would ever cross those same seas, Spaniard, Englishman, dreamer, conqueror, slave, all woven into the same relentless refrain, "Guard, bury, awaken." And so history itself became the cargo of their voyages, hidden deeper than amber or fur, hidden in blood, in dream, in the whispering soil that awaited the next footstep, the next oath, the next defiance, for the burden had not ended in Joran's fire. It had only begun. The burden did not rest, and though Joran's flame had been scattered into the storm of remembrance, its embers smoldered in every age that followed, a fire hidden but unquenched, a whisper that pressed itself into the marrow of men, bending their oaths, guiding their sails, and binding their destinies to shores they did not yet know. For when the dragon ships first split the mists of Vinland, their prows painted with snarling beasts, and their sails billowing with the breath of the north wind, it was not only hunger for land or plunder that carried them, but the unseen pulse of memory, the same chain Joran had raged against. And though the warriors boasted of conquest, of axes biting into foreign forests and halls raised upon alien soil, the land itself received them not as masters but as heirs of a prophecy too vast for their tongues to speak. And so the seers of the native tribes, wrapped in smoke and owl feathers, watched from the forest shadows and trembled, not because pale-haired strangers had come, but because the songs of their ancestors had long whispered of fire-bearers from across the sea, men who carried fragments of an oath older than their own myths. And thus when Norse and native first locked eyes, they did not meet as strangers but as participants in a drama written before their births, a convergence of sagas across oceans, and the earth itself seemed to hum beneath their feet with the refrain, "Guard Barry, awaken." The Vikings laughed at these whispers, telling themselves they were masters of axe and oar, yet at night when the mead drained low and the fire cracked in the dark, they dreamt of spiraled stones humming with resonance, of serpent temples devouring the moon, of vaults where flames did not flicker but breathed, and when they woke they spoke nothing of it, yet still the visions gnawed their courage, for in the forests they found what their dreams had shown, stones carved by hands too ancient to name, spirals that bent the light of the sun, masks with hollow eyes that seemed to see beyond flesh, and the chieftains mocked their own fear, calling the land cursed, yet secretly they knew they were not first upon those shores, and as their longhouses rose, their grave mounds swelled, the soil of Vinland seemed restless, whispering in winds, promising that what had been buried would not remain so forever, for the architects still watched, their constellations bending like chains across the sky. Each star a link, each constellation a shackle, and though the Vikings could not name them, they felt the weight in their blood, and so their children were born already dreaming of serpents coiled in oceans of fire, of towers buried beneath mountains, of songs sung in tongues that turned bone to ash, and those dreams were not confined to the Northmen alone, for when centuries turned and Iberian sails cut the horizon, bearing cross and cannon, those who came believed themselves to be bearers of new gods, new laws, new empires, yet even they stepped into a stage long prepared, into a theater lit centuries before by Joran's flame. And they too felt the weight, though they named it providence, though they wrote it down as destiny, yet destiny and burden were one and the same, and the soil received them with equal silence, whispering the refrain into their sleep, "Guard Barry, awaken." And as villages burned and empires fell, as temples were toppled and idols shattered, the true secret endured, hidden in crypts beneath forests, in caverns beneath cliffs, in runes no man yet dared decipher, the flame of memory smoldering. Still, for Joran's defiance had not ended in his roar but carried forward across every keel, every oath, every conquest, binding even those who thought themselves free. And so it was that history itself became infected, each age thinking itself new while merely repeating what had already been, until the burden was not only in Viking blood but in every hand that touched the oceans, every eye that looked to the horizon, every dream that sought to pierce beyond the known, and across the centuries. The architects, vast and silent, bore witness, their helms of stone veiling eyes that had seen the birth of suns, and they whispered to one another in voices that rippled through earthquakes, through eclipses, through plagues, watching mankind stumble from memory to memory, from fire to fire, until the refrain itself became invisible law, shaping rivers, bending mountains, guiding sails, and though kings rose and fell, prophets thundered and faded, conquerors bled and rotted, still the burden endured, waiting for its vessel, waiting for its breaker, waiting for the one who would take Joran's flame not as curse but as crown, and the lands across the ocean stirred like sleepers restless in their dreams, the forests murmuring, the mountains trembling, the oceans sighing, all awaiting the hour when memory would awaken not in whispers but in storms, and mankind, whether Viking or Spaniard or nameless wanderer, would learn that their voyages were not choices but compulsions, not beginnings but continuations, not conquests but remembrances, and the refrain would sound louder than war horns, louder than sermons, louder than empire itself. Guard Barry, awaken! Guard Barry, awaken! Until silence itself cracked beneath its weight, until the very stars trembled as though they too were bound by the same chain. And yet, as the stars trembled as though they too were bound by the same chain, the burden pressed heavier upon the earth, for chains do not merely bind the living but echo into the soil, into the bones of the dead, into the dust of civilizations that thought themselves eternal yet were only brief sparks in the vast fire of memory. And so the burden that Jorund had roared against, and that the Vikings unknowingly carried, did not sleep in silence but twisted itself into the fabric of ages, pulling empires toward shores they did not intend, bending kings to desires they thought their own, and drawing prophets to visions they believed divine though they were but fragments of an oath whispered in the marrow of the world. And thus, when the Spaniards raised their crosses upon the shores of the west, they believed themselves chosen by heaven, yet their very ships creaked with the refrain, "Guard, bury, awaken," and the soil beneath their boots seemed to remember long before they arrived, for in the forests of Vinland, in the deserts of Anahuac, in the mountains where condors circled, relics of older builders awaited them, stones inscribed with spirals that mocked the crucifix and eyes carved wider than the skulls of men, and those stones hummed faintly when touched, as though remembering the same flame that had once devoured Jorund, and the friars wrote in their chronicles of idols shattered, yet they whispered secretly of dreams where those idols spoke in tongues that turned prayers to ash, and soldiers claimed victory, yet their children were born restless, plagued by visions of serpent coils beneath oceans, of ladders stretching into the sky, woven from chains of stars, of caverns where fire breathed instead of burned, and the conquistadors laughed in daylight, mocking the old gods, but in darkness they shivered, for the refrain threaded even their veins, whispering through bloodlines they did not understand, until the very idea of conquest became something else, not a triumph but a contagion, spreading the flame of memory into every tongue, every script, every hymn. And the architects watched in silence as they had always watched, shifting their constellations above the sleeping earth, bending rivers and mountains beneath the feet of men, ensuring that the burden was never forgotten, only disguised, dressed in the garb of empire or faith, yet always the same whisper, always the same chain. And so centuries rolled like waves, and in each age the refrain surfaced, sometimes in dreams of shepherds, sometimes in the visions of queens, sometimes in the madness of beggars who claimed they had seen the sky unmasked, and in every instance the words were the same, "Guard, bury, awaken." And so the story that had begun with a Viking oath now lay hidden in manuscripts bound in Spanish leather, in codices smuggled beneath altars, in sagas sung by griots in lands the Norse had never known. And though oceans divided them, though languages split them, still the burden wove them together, a net cast wide across centuries, waiting for the moment when the fire would no longer whisper but blaze once more. And in this weaving the native seers of the West continued to tremble, for their prophecies had never ended, only deepened, and as generations passed, their songs spoke more urgently of pale-haired strangers not as conquerors but as vessels of an ancient oath, and they warned that when the oceans were fully crossed and the world encircled, the burden would awaken in storms, storms that would sweep not only men but memory itself, erasing boundaries between past and present, so that all would recall what they had long forgotten, and even the stars, trembling in their chains, would bear witness. And it was in this age of tangled empires and restless soil that whispers spread of vaults beneath mountains in the New World, vaults sealed before Norse or Spaniard, vaults humming with fire that was not fire, and though conquistadors searched for gold, what they unearthed were stones cut so precisely that even steel could not mark them, masks with eyes that burned faintly in moonlight, staircases that descended into darkness no torch could conquer, and always, always the refrain returned, "Guard, bury, awaken," until priests and warriors alike began to sense that their gods, their kings, their empires were not the masters of this land but guests in a drama older than scripture, older than saga, older than the stars themselves, and in their unease they built churches atop pyramids, fortresses atop ruins, believing they could smother the memory. Yet the memory seeped through the cracks, so that the bells of cathedrals rang in harmony with the hum of buried temples, and the soil itself seemed to mock their conquest, for harvests failed, storms devoured fleets, and cities drowned in fire and plague, and the chroniclers wrote of punishment from God, yet beneath their ink trembled the unspoken truth. They too were caught in the chain, and the burden that Jorund had defied was now their inheritance, their curse, their fate. And across oceans the Norse sagas and the Spanish chronicles began to mirror one another, both carrying fragments of the same secret, both unknowingly preserving the same oath, until it became impossible to tell whether history was a line of progress or a circle of remembrance, and the architects, silent still, allowed mankind to stagger onward, waiting for the moment when the burden would erupt not as whisper but as storm, and men would learn that their ships, their empires, their fates had been but kindling for the fire Jorund had loosed into the marrow of the world, and, as centuries waned, explorers from every shore carried the refrain further, French traders into the northern rivers, English settlers into forests that groaned with memory, Africans torn from their homelands and forced into the west, all of them bearing the same invisible cargo, all of them dreaming the same spiraled stones, the same serpent temples, the same vaults humming in the dark, and the refrain braided their sufferings, their hopes, their oaths, into one vast song, a song that neither whip nor cannon could silence, for it was not born of men but of the earth itself, of the architects who had carved chains into the stars, and thus the burden became not only history but destiny, pressing forward, expanding outward, until the very oceans seemed restless, tides swelling higher, storms striking fiercer, as though the sea itself remembered, as though it sought to awaken. And still mankind told themselves they were masters, still they carved borders, raised flags, sang anthems, yet beneath every act the whisper continued, guard, bury, awaken. And it was this whisper that haunted the dreamers of every age, the madmen who sketched impossible maps, the poets who wept at visions they could not explain, the captains who vanished chasing horizons, for all of them were pulled by the same unseen chain, the same oath that would not die, and so history marched, unaware that it was not marching toward progress but toward a reckoning, a remembering, a storm that would break when the world itself could no longer bear the weight of silence, and the flame that Jorund had carried would awaken in full, no longer hidden in saga or prophecy, but roaring across the heavens themselves, until the very stars would no longer tremble but fall.